It's me, Alyssa, and I am coming back at you with my fun little web series called Creative Play, where I'm sharing some fun tutorials and creative inspiration to hopefully keep you occupied and inspired during this time. So today I thought it would be fun to share with you guys a few different ways to draw a mandala. For me, drawing a mandala is actually one of my favorite things to do because I'm able to kind of like space out or chill out. Some of my favorite things when it comes to creativity are the things that make my mind just like completely get lost in the process. And drawing mandalas for me feels a little bit like doodling or scribbling, where I can just turn my brain off. So I'm going to break it down and show you a few different ways to draw a mandala. So I actually offer a few online classes on this very topic, but in this video I wanted to at least give you guys some good free concepts and content to get you maybe drawing some mandalas, to really have something that you can mess around with, have a relaxing creative process that might enable you to have just a little bit of chill time when it comes to hanging out at home. So this process can be used by anybody, any level, any age. I'm going to show you a few different ways to create mandalas, everything from like imperfect and wonky mandalas to actually planning things out a little bit and using a compass. Okay, so let's get started creating. I'm going to show you guys what I use when I create my own mandalas over here. Okay, so again, you can use just about any supplies for creating mandala drawings and paintings and illustrations, that type of thing, or even mandala inspired art. Some things that I always have on hand, I'm going to keep it really simple for you guys. I've got just basic computer paper over here, printer paper. Sometimes it helps to have something round to trace. So I like washi tape, masking tape, a bowl, a cup. I'll grab anything round around the house to just give myself an outline of something to work within. If you want to get really nitpicky and really plan things out, you can also use a compass to draw lines, and I'm going to show you guys how you can kind of map out what you will draw within. But really, you could freehand a mandala if you really want. I like doing it all different ways, again using a variety of different supplies. And while I'm keeping my supplies super simple, I just want to let you know again, you can use just about anything for this process. So let's get started. So we are going to start with just like a freehand mandala concept. I'm not using any circles to trace or plan out. I am literally freehanding it. And the way I like to do this is literally just start with a tiny circle in the middle and then build out. And for me, oftentimes this looks quite floral, like a little daisy. It's got petals. But you can keep in mind as you watch me freehand this, it can be any shape. It can be geometric, curvy shapes, shapes from your imagination. But I like to then build things off of that initial shape and keep going and going and building and building. Something to keep in mind when you are just freehanding it and letting things be imperfect and wonky is one side might be bigger or it might be a little bit oblong here and there. That's okay. Freehanding those mandalas is a fun way to play around with the concept of doodling, mess around with ideas even. Freehanding it is also a really good exercise for people of all different ages, for kids as well, where you can really play around with the concept of building off of just that initial shape in the middle. So you can see how quickly I've created something that looks and feels like a pretty imperfect mandala, but through the use of just those basic shapes and building off of them. And the key, at least for me, is really repeating those basic shapes over and over again as you build out. And the more you add on, the larger your mandala is going to be. You're going to see me in a variety of little ways do this differently. Sometimes I like to keep them small. Sometimes I like to build them way out with bigger shapes and designs. I'm just going to build off of this one just a little bit. But I know in the back of my head, once I've got these big basic shapes going on, I can go back in and add little details or doodles, marks, lines. Repeating little embellishments will suddenly turn this wonky little mandala into something that feels a little bit more detailed and elevated. So this first step for me is just kind of getting the basic outline of those areas and spaces that I know I can go back into. And here's where the fun happens, at least in my brain. Once you've got all this space, you can then go back into into it with finer lines, details, little marks. You can get really creative with the things that you add. We're keeping it real simple right now just to give you the basics, but I like kind of tracing around or following the curve of some of my shapes. I love polka dots. I love scallops on edges, triangles on edges. And something I've found that's really fun to do within the process is play around with your own shapes and symbols and designs. And these are all things that you can add within those mandalas, whether they are freehand and wonky and weird, or if they're really, really planned out. I like to kind of keep these little guides I make for myself with little shapes, little marks, things that I can add to the inside of my mandala. And I always use these types of things for reference. They look really simple right now on my pages, on my paper. Oftentimes they're just really simple shapes or a scribble or a loop or a scallop, but they end up being things that will actually really elevate some of those mandala drawings and paintings as you move forward. And I love kind of challenging people to sit down and create their own, almost like a symbol guide, where you can start hiding things within your mandala that are meaningful to you, things that represent something in your life or symbolize something. So then the mandalas that you draw and mess around with are really unique to you and your own experiences. And all of those shapes and symbols and designs are what you can add to the inside of those larger shapes. So if for some reason you get stuck and you're feeling like, I don't know what to add to this, if you've got kind of this basic guide for yourself, you can play around with some of those different symbols and shapes, adding them to that space in your mandalas. Another way you can approach an imperfect, wonky mandala that you just freehand is just filling your surface with a bunch of circles and then playing around with what you add to those circles. It's a really fun process for those of you who maybe are kids or younger, or even some of you out there who are not quite comfortable with the whole concept of drawing or even doodling. This is just giving yourself freedom to play around within those circles. You're going to notice my own circles, they are completely off kilter. They're wonky, they're wobbly looking, they are not perfect, but that's okay. This process enables you to kind of practice building off of a circle with those little designs and symbols, building off of it and kind of growing it out with all the embellishments that you choose to add. And I love stacking and layering them across the surface. So I love a mandala in the middle of a page, but I also love stacking and layering and filling an entire surface with these wonky, imperfect mandalas as a way to kind of create pattern on a page. Because what you're going to notice really quickly as this little drawing progresses is that as you fill that space, it starts to look quite detailed and elevated. It looks less like just a little drawing in the middle, and it looks more like some unique pattern that really's got a lot of interest, a lot of embellishments and details happening. So you can play around with this concept by stacking them, using different sizes, small ones next to big ones, and then challenging yourself to fill that space. Maybe it's in one day or one sitting, or maybe you return to it over a series of days where eventually you've got this surface filled with these really, really interesting, totally imperfect mandalas. Okay, well, I love a lot of pen and ink work and line work. I also love using paint for this process. Watercolors actually really lend themselves to playing around with those imperfect mandalas because, in my opinion, color turns anything that's imperfect into something that feels super dynamic. So I'm literally doing the same exact thing I did in the other two little videos before this, but I'm using my brush and I'm just using watercolors. I'm building a circle and then I'm adding things to the inside of it. And because I'm using watercolors, I can let those edges bleed and that color kind of blend into each other. And you're going to get these really beautiful, unexpected things happening on the surface. As long as that color is wet, things are going to blend into each other. And as they dry, it's just going to look really unexpected. It's very unpredictable, very free form. Anytime you're using wet media, you're not going to be able to control it as much as you would if you were using a pen or markers. But that's what I love so much about it because it kind of sets you free from perfection. So again, this is just another way to approach that concept of an imperfect mandala where you are filling those circles with shapes. You're building things out. And as you build them out, you start adding smaller details within those bigger shapes. And the only thing you have to keep in mind once you start adding color is just being mindful of the color that you're using. You probably don't want things to turn to mud or get brown or mucky in there. So you just have to really be mindful when you're picking your colors. If there's at any point it feels like your colors are mixing too much and you don't want them blending together, you just let that surface dry a little bit and then go right back into it, and you'll have a lot more control over the things happening. But notice in this little painting I'm doing, it's so imperfect, you guys. My petals are off. My circle is not perfect. My colors are blending quite a bit. I don't have a lot of control. Oftentimes when I film tutorials for both my classes and here on YouTube, I don't plan a lot out. I'm letting you guys watch me work and make decisions in live time. So as I'm working, I know there's stuff happening that I'm not like super stoked about. I know that I wish some of those petals were shaped differently, or some of my colors weren't blending as much. But I want you just to see that often when you are in a process like this, no matter what you're creating, no matter what the subject matter is, there's going to be moments where it feels like it's not working, and then there'll be moments where you fall in love with certain areas of it. But I just want to encourage you, as you work through something like a mandala in an imperfect way, just accept the imperfections. Try to accept if they're off or a little wonky or imperfect. I have found when it comes to freehanding mandala designs like this, even if you do feel like you've made a mistake and something's not matching up, as you build those shapes out, you can often visually trick the eye by kind of covering things up. So I don't know if you guys can tell what I did, but on the left-hand side of my flower, there's two petals that are a lot shorter than the rest of my petals. And by building those larger scallops out that I'm now filling with those details, by building that, it kind of visually tricks your eye where stuff starts to kind of fall in place and line up. So even though there's imperfections, things aren't matching up, they're not the perfect size, as you build things off of that design, you can kind of cover them up by adding and choosing shapes that maybe play off of some of those imperfections, and suddenly things don't become so obvious or feel so imperfect or even wonky. But I say embrace the imperfections when you're working this way, especially if you are using a brush and water. It's not easy. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's not easy at first to use a brush to draw, and especially if you're using wet media, it's really hard to control at times. So give yourself a lot of forgiveness and grace if you're working through something like this. Play around with it. Just give yourself permission to play, even if it's imperfect. So I'm going to let you guys watch me work over the rest of this, fill up my surface, and then we'll dive into how you can start planning out those mandalas a little bit more. Okay, so if you are looking to create a little bit more of a planned out, I don't want to say perfect because nothing's ever perfect, but a little bit more mindful of a mandala, you're going to want to use either a compass or some kind of circle that you can trace around. I'm using a compass just to map out my lines. You can see even my little map I've got is super imperfect because that's how I roll, you guys. But I've layered up a bunch of different circles, and these are the circles that I'm going to work within so that all of my embellishments, all of my shapes are relatively the same size. Now, if you are super patient and have the ability to measure things out, a lot of times people will even measure things out within those different sizes of circles to make sure every single shape is absolute perfection. Again, I just don't work that way. I'm not happy working that way. But I do love giving myself just kind of a basic guideline to work within. Something else I want you to keep in mind while you watch me is that I am actually most comfortable just grabbing my pen and going for it. But you can absolutely use a pencil to get all those designs down and then go right back over the top of them and trace over them with your pen. So please do not do it the way I'm doing it. It's uncomfortable and scary. I know that for a lot of people, but it's just the way that I tend to like to work. But I'm just using a plain old Sharpie just so you guys can see that you can use simple materials. Something you're also going to notice as you watch me work through this is there's still a lot of imperfection happening. I already know there's a couple petals in there that are off. They are not the exact same size, and that is okay. Anything that I teach and I share, I am always encouraging you guys to just break free from rules and boundaries and guidelines and just embrace playing in the moment and messing around with your ideas. But what that outline's going to give you is just this basic framework to work within. So everything's going to start to look and feel a lot more uniform, and a lot of the same size happening. So I do the same thing I did in my imperfect mandalas. I am just picking some of my favorite shapes. I really tend to use a lot of petal designs, a lot of different shapes that I pull from flowers, things from nature. Have a lot of these go-to shapes and designs that I enjoy using in my own mandalas, and that's what you're watching me do, is just work through the basics and just getting those big areas, those big shapes mapped out, so then I can return and go back into it and fill things up with polka dots, lines, more embellishments, and really play around with how I fill that space. One of the best tips I can give for creating your own mandalas is really being aware and mindful of that space and contrast. If you guys follow me, you will know that I say this all the time, but just adding some contrast here and there is going to really quickly create like a push and pull between things. You can see I'm darkening up some of those areas. It really quickly creates a little bit more pop in that surface. Messing around with maybe large shapes next to smaller shapes is going to get things looking more interesting. It's going to create these illusions of a lot of embellishments and details going on without a lot of thinking and work. So I wanted to show you guys how you can even get more detailed and more planned out with that space. And you can really easily grab a ruler, grab some sort of straight edge, and you can start adding lines to divide up that space. Really give yourself more of a guideline to work within by adding even more details that all have the basic same size. So again, you could approach this like I am. I'm just basically freehanding it and eyeballing it, but you could pull out that ruler. You could measure things and make sure every little space that you're mapping out is the exact same size. That's just not something I tend to do a lot of, but you could absolutely do that if you are one of those people that needs things to feel a little bit more perfect or matching up in a perfect way. But you'll see, just making this little change for me enables me to really get some more designs in there with more consistency with the size that those designs are. So I love freehanding and eyeballing it, but even me, my brain sometimes needs a little bit more guidelines or things to work within. And I want you guys just to see that you can really approach this in a variety of different ways. So you've got this guideline, you've got some lines you can fill in and start playing around with those shapes that are even created within those lines. And I personally love doing like this contrast between really round shapes, really round designs next to more geometric shapes. So I do a lot with triangles, a lot with scallops and half circles, a lot with those petal shapes. But once you've got, those penciled lines mapped out for yourself, you can work within them without feeling like maybe you're going to mess something up or something's going to go wrong. Again, this is just another way if you're trying to get away from things being imperfect and wonky and you're wanting to kind of contain them and get things looking real uniform, this is the way you're going to do it. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I still got lots of wonky stuff going on in here. You can notice a lot of my triangles right now are not the same size at all. They are off. And I'm okay with that. I'm just going to keep working within that circle and all those guidelines I put for myself with my pencil designs. And just know that once I start adding more embellishments, more shapes, building things out, some of those imperfections are going to disappear and it's going to just trick the eye visually. But again, if that bugs you, if you're watching me going, oh my gosh, there's 5 triangles that are a different size than the other ones, then the solution would be to grab your ruler and measure out how large you want some of that space and make sure it's all the same size. You don't have to do it. I'm just saying, if you feel like you need that for your brain, that is what you're going to do if you are looking for more perfection within those mandalas. But for me, I find that I can really play around with the shapes that I add to offset some of the mistakes that I make or some of the imperfections that I make. This process for me this is literally just turning my brain off and playing and kind of chilling out. When I draw a mandala, I'm actually not even creating it for any reason. I'm just doing it like I would maybe more of a doodling process where you can just sit, watch TV, play around on that surface, kind of let your brain go. For me, if I start measuring things or planning them out too much, for me, that defeats the whole reason I do this. But if for some reason you're feeling like you want to get really detailed and you want to go more of a perfection route, just make sure you measure things out. Make sure all those lines, the map that you've made for yourself with those circles with the compass, is generally the same size. So you can see that I've got a difference happening in between my wonky mandalas and the one that I planned out a little bit more. So this one's got a lot more uniformity to it, whereas my wonky freehand ones, there's things a little bit off. They're just not quite perfect. This one's got a more refined approach and look to it. But you guys, either way works. Either way is fun. Either way is creative. And either way really gives you the opportunity to doodle and play around with lines and designs on a surface in a really creative way. I'm going to show you a few more ways that I like to do this to hopefully get you inspired to start playing around with mandalas. Okay, so you can take this approach and start getting creative with a variety of different tools and supplies, as well as the size or scale when you create a mandala. I like using acrylic paint, watercolor paint, ink, markers, you name it, I'll use it. I also love working quite large. So this time around, I just created myself just a watercolor blue background. I'm just working on butcher paper, you guys, so it's not perfect. It kind of bled into my paper a little bit, but it's got kind of a cool effect happening. I mapped out my lines and then I'm using my watercolors to go in and do all of that line work. So I can fill in some of that space with color. I can add fine lines, dark lines, bold lines. And when you start layering those mandalas on top of maybe a colorful background or some unique surface, you get some really, really cool results. And that's what I love so much about the mandala process is it can be as simple as just kind of playing around with those messy, wonky designs, or you can start getting really intricate and detailed and mindful and specific about your materials, about layering, about color, and really elevate it and take it to a different level. I love incorporating mandalas into my art journal pages. I love using them in the background of my acrylic paintings. I play around with them in a variety of different ways. I'll doodle them on a page while I'm on the phone, but then I will sit down and create a really, really large one over a span of days. So I want you guys to hopefully feel a little bit inspired, a little bit empowered to mess around with the mandala process, whether it's super perfect or whether it's completely wonky and imperfect. You can really approach the process in so many different ways. So I'm going to let you watch me finish up these mandalas and hopefully you feel inspired to shut this video off, pull out some of your favorite art supplies, and get creative with mandalas.